What if I told you that the woman your family calls the failure is the same person holding your father's heart surgery schedule in her hands right now? What if the daughter your mother introduces as the one who scrubs floors is actually the person who decides which specialist your family sees, how fast, and at what cost? That was my life for 15 years. And this Thanksgiving, it finally ended, not because I planned it, but because my grandmother decided she was done watching a lie get repeated one more time. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, my own family had absolutely no idea what I actually did for a living. Not because I was secretive in some dramatic, mysterious way, but because somewhere around my 24th birthday, my mother had already decided who I was, and she never once bothered to update the file. This is the story of the dinner, where that file finally got corrected, in front of 19 relatives, a bottle of wine that cost more than my rent, and a $50 bill that ended up meaning more than anyone at that table could have guessed. Thanksgiving at my parents' house always followed the same choreography, the same tablecloth, the same seating chart that somehow always put me at the far end, near the kids' table, even though I hadn't been a kid in over a decade. The same performance from my mother, Margaret, who treated every holiday gathering like a stage she'd been rehearsing for all year. This year was supposed to be no different. I walked in wearing the same navy cardigan I always wore to these dinners. Plain, unremarkable, the kind of thing that made me blend into whatever version of me my family had already decided existed. I set my dish of roasted Brussels sprouts on the counter, right next to my sister Renee's elaborate pecan pie, the one she'd clearly ordered from the bakery downtown and was passing off as her own baking. Renee arrived 40 minutes late, in a cream silk blouse, her husband Trevor trailing a step behind her with a bottle of wine tucked under his arm that probably cost more than my entire grocery budget for the month. And just like every year, the room seemed to brighten the moment she walked in, like she carried her own spotlight with her wherever she went. My mother hugged her first, held her at arm's length, then announced to the room, loud enough for the Kowalski cousins, Aunt Denise, Uncle Harold, and everyone else crowded around the buffet table to hear, that Renee had just been named Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at Lakeview Regional Hospital. Applause. Genuine, warm, enthusiastic applause. Then my mother's eyes drifted over to me, and I watched her decide, in real time, what story she wanted to tell about her other daughter. And this one, she said, gesturing at me the way you gesture at a coffee stain on a white tablecloth, cleans hotel rooms for a living. 19 relatives turned to look at me. Nobody laughed, because nobody was quite sure if it was supposed to be a joke. But nobody corrected her either, because as far as any of them knew, it was simply true. That was the story my mother had been telling for over a decade, and none of them had any reason to doubt it. My father, Richard, a man who had never once in 36 years asked me a single follow-up question about my actual life, reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and slid it across the table toward me like he was tipping a valet outside a restaurant. Here, he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. Go treat yourself to something nice after all that scrubbing. A few people chuckled, uncertain, testing whether laughter was actually allowed in this moment. I looked at that $50 bill sitting on the white tablecloth, right between the pecan pie and the gravy boat, and I did not flinch. I didn't reach for it, and I didn't push it away either. I just let it sit there while I finished chewing because I had learned a long time ago that reacting was exactly what my mother wanted. My silence was the one thing she had never been able to script a response to. What none of them knew, what I had never bothered to correct, because, frankly, I had stopped expecting my family to ask real questions about my life around the time I turned 25, was that I don't clean anything. I hadn't cleaned a single room in over 12 years. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Ashcombe Regional Health Network, the umbrella system that owns and operates 5 hospitals across the state. That includes Lakeview Regional, the very hospital where my sister had just been promoted. And it includes Brookhaven Medical Center, the hospital where my own parents had been patients for the last 7 years, where my father gets his cardiac checkups, and where my mother had her knee replacement 14 months ago. Every referral, every specialist consult, every insurance authorization, every single piece of paperwork that determined how quickly my parents got seen and by whom ran at some point through a system I had helped build and now helped run. I had never told them this. Partly because early in my career, I had tried to explain my work and watched my mother's eyes glaze over the moment I said the word operations instead of surgery. She wanted a daughter she could brag about in one sentence, and hospital administration never landed the way cardiothoracic surgeon did. But partly, and this is the part I'm less proud of, some quiet, stubborn part of me had wanted to see exactly how long she would keep telling the story about me without ever once asking if it was true. The $50 bill was still sitting on the tablecloth when my grandmother, Eleanor, who had been quiet through the entire exchange, set down her fork with a small, deliberate click against her plate. Grandma Eleanor is 82 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and the only person in that entire family who had never once asked me to justify my life to her. She stood up slowly, the way she does now, one hand braced against the table for support, and looked directly at my mother, not at me. "Margaret," she said, in the voice she uses when she is finished being polite, "tell them where your daughter actually works." The table went silent in a different way than it had gone silent before. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Trevor stopped mid-sip of his expensive wine, the glass frozen halfway to his lips. Aunt Denise leaned forward like she'd been waiting her whole life for exactly this moment of family theater to unfold in front of her. My mother looked at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I watched something like genuine uncertainty cross her face, because she realized, standing there in front of 19 relatives, that she genuinely did not know the answer to her own mother's question. And whatever answer was coming was not going to be the one she had spent years telling. The silence stretched long enough that I could actually hear the kitchen clock ticking from the next room. My mother finally found her voice, and it came out smaller than I had ever heard it before. "She works in administration," she said, and the word administration landed like an apology she didn't know how to finish. Grandma Eleanor tilted her head, unimpressed. "Administration where, Margaret?" My mother looked at me now. Actually looked at me, maybe for the first time in years, silently begging me to fill in a blank she couldn't fill in herself. I set down my napkin and decided that after 36 years of being the family's convenient punchline, I was done protecting everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. "I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Ashcombe Regional Health Network," I said, keeping my voice level, the same voice I use in board meetings when I need a room full of people to actually listen. "I oversee 5 hospitals, including Lakeview Regional, where Renee was just promoted, and including Brookhaven Medical, where Mom and Dad have been patients for 7 years. The table went from silent to something closer to frozen. My father's hand, still resting near the $50 bill, went completely still. Renee's fork clattered softly against her plate as she set it down, her expression shifting from polished confidence to something raw, something that looked almost like fear. "That's not," my mother started, then stopped, because she could see in my face that it was, in fact, exactly true. I kept going, because I had waited a long time to say this, and I wasn't about to waste the opportunity. Dad's cardiologist, Dr. Alvarez, reports up through my division. The scheduling system that got Mom her knee replacement 14 months ago, faster than her insurance normally allows. I approved that pilot program myself. I've spent 7 years quietly making sure this family got the best care available. And I never said a word about it, because every single time I tried to talk about my job, I watched everyone's eyes glaze over the second I stopped sounding like a surgeon. My mother's face had gone pale, the particular kind of pale that comes from realizing you've been telling a story about someone for years without ever once checking whether it was true. "Why didn't you correct me?" she asked. And it wasn't really a question. It was closer to a confession. "Because you never asked," I said simply. "Not once. You decided who I was when I was 22 years old, and you never bothered to update the file." Uncle Harold let out a low whistle under his breath. Aunt Denise had both hands pressed over her mouth. The cousins were exchanging glances like they had just watched a magic trick they couldn't quite explain. My father finally spoke, and his voice cracked in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before. "The $50, he said, staring down at the bill still sitting on the tablecloth. "I was just trying to." He didn't finish the sentence, because there was no version of it that didn't sound exactly as small as it actually was. I picked up the bill, folded it once, and slid it gently back across the table toward him. "Buy Mom something nice," I said. "I don't need—" Renee, to her credit, was the first one to actually move past the shock. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from my sister in years, something that looked almost like the way she used to look at me when we were kids, back when she still thought I was the smart one. "Claire," she said quietly, "I had no idea. You never said anything at any of the hospital events. I would have introduced you properly." "I know," I said, and I meant it without any bitterness, because the truth was, I had made a choice every single time to stay quiet. And today, I had simply made a different one. Grandma Eleanor reached over and patted my hand, her skin soft and thin the way it gets when someone has earned every single wrinkle honestly. "I've known for 3 years," she said, and the whole table turned to stare at her now instead of me. "Your mother never asks anyone anything real. I figured you'd tell them when you were ready." My mother sat there for a long moment, and then, quietly, in a voice stripped of its usual performance, she said, "I'm sorry, Claire." It wasn't a grand apology. It didn't erase 15 years of being introduced as the daughter who cleans hotel rooms. But it was the first honest thing my mother had said to me at that table in longer than I could remember. And for now, that was enough. The rest of dinner was quieter than usual. But it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes after something true finally gets said out loud, instead of staying buried under 36 years of assumptions. I don't know if Thanksgiving next year will look any different. I don't know if my mother will introduce me correctly the next time we're standing in a room full of relatives. But I know that I finally stopped making myself small just to keep everyone else comfortable. And that felt like the actual gift I gave myself this year, worth more than any $50 bill ever could. Looking back on that dinner now, I don't think the moment that changed everything was my mother's apology, or even the shocked faces around that table. I think it was the quiet click of my grandmother's fork against her plate, the sound of one person deciding that a lie, no matter how comfortable, had gone on long enough. Sometimes the people who love us the most aren't the ones who ask the loudest questions. They're the ones who simply refuse to keep repeating a story they know isn't true. My grandmother never made a scene about it for 3 years. She just waited, patiently, for the moment I was ready, and then she made sure the truth had nowhere left to hide. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this story to take away, it's this: you don't owe anyone a performance of yourself just to make your own family comfortable. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't shouting the truth from the rooftops. It's simply letting the silence sit there, the way I let that $50 bill sit on the tablecloth, until the people around you are finally forced to ask the right question themselves.